First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming out today and engage in this conversation. So let me just do a quick recap so you can understand the purpose behind this. Leading off with the work of the NOAA working group in Bloomington, roughly 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 now, really came up with a series of issues and items they wanted the city of Bloomington to look at in terms of affordability. And what really emerged out of that was three key things that we've been working on. One was the creation of a new fair housing policy, which was accomplished in 2018. The creation of a 90-day tenant protection ordinance, which was also created and adopted in 2018. And then the creation of a comprehensive affordable housing ordinance entitled Opportunity Housing Ordinance that was created and adopted in February of 2019, this year. And the goal behind the creation of the ordinance was simply creating an ordinance that does a couple of different things. One, does not stop development. It supports development by having tools and incentives that really provide an offset of the cost of affordability. So when you really start to drill down into the ordinance, the idea was creating a comprehensive document that really got feedback from private developers, affordable housing developers, advocates, city departments. Everybody weighed in on this document. So in doing this process, a couple of things we said we're going to do, because the document is not a static document. It's not built and it's done and it goes on the shelf. This is a document that will continue to evolve as we continue to learn more and more about the work of development. So in that process, a couple of things has happened. We said, one, to the council that we would do a series of things. One would be some edits and adjustments to the ordinance, led by planning, legal. Recently, at the last city council meeting, we presented some amendments to the ordinance. And that was really considered sort of internal cleanup. The next wave of cleanup on the ordinance will come after September 1st, when the ordinance goes into effect. That's when we're going to start to learn even more about the work that's being done related to the ordinance. A couple of different things also added to that was, one, we would build a sort of developer education tool, which is really our guidebook and an operating model that developers can start to plug in their incentives and choices in terms of how they're going to utilize the ordinance. And the third part to that would be the education session tonight to really start to explain how this basically works. And then sort of later on tonight, we have a study session also talking about this issue. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Daedalus, but also before I do that, the ordinance is backed by significant research. I don't know what other communities are doing, but Bloomington drilled down, all the way down on this issue. So when you want to understand how we got to the 9%, how the economy is linked to it, how the number of market rate units generates a certain portion of need for affordability, you know, the Nexus study, the work done by Daedalus and Bay Area Economics, along with ongoing engagement and feedback from the council and staff, really help us shape this document. So with that, turn it over to Sean from Daedalus, and we'll get into this exciting exercise.
All right, so in a nutshell, what we're going to do, I'm going to cover a little bit of the same ground that you just heard Eric talk to you about, which is a little bit more nuance about what happened to get us to this point. Then we're going to dive into the ordinance itself, what it requires, and some of what you should be cognizant about if you're either building or working with builders to meet the requirements of the ordinance. Then we're going to get into a relatively long section that looks into, we're going to do a process view first. Cherie's going to help me with that, where we're going to walk you through how the actual process works with planning. Then we're going to go into a reasonably long section where we walk through both the satisfaction mechanisms of the ordinance, meaning how do you comply with it, and with the incentives that are available. Because there are a lot of incentives, and we want to make sure that the public has had a chance to hear what those incentives are, how they're applied, so when they go back, when you go back to your other firms, business partners, whatever, you have a reasonably good handle on what the ordinance offers. Then finally, we're going to do a couple of examples. It's only 3, but we can use it as talking points. So we've sort of changed the units and locations and things to give us a framework for asking and answering questions. So it won't just be me talking. I'll ask you things and you guys ask me. And then after that, it's just free question period. So makes sense? Everyone okay with that? Yeah. Okay, so why are we here? Eric gave you the core high-level view that there's a bunch of work that was done, and there's a group called Bay Area Economics that worked with us about a year ago on a nexus study and doing a bunch of financial models. And what we were trying to do was not just quantify the scale of affordable housing that's needed, but also look at how you could estimate the induced demand that comes from building new market rate units. And that logic tends to trip people up. So the way the Nexus study works is it looks at assuming that new households are moving into an area, they bring with them certain consumption patterns. Some portion of their consumption triggers demand for jobs at lower income levels, right? Those lower income levels in turn need places to live. So as the new residents move in, as the new households move in, you're actually inducing demand for housing at the same time. So BAE did a very thorough job of walking through how to arrive at that number. What they found is for every 100 units of market rate development, you would induce demand for 9 new units of affordable housing. That's where the 9% comes from. And the in lieu fee, the $9.60 number, comes from doing a similar set of analyses, but against developer cost and profit numbers and looking at what would be affordable within reason, and also benchmarking against other communities in other places and what they've charged. With me so far? So that's the core. You'll see these numbers come from now until we end this session. 9% of the units and $9.60. They repeat constantly. So what does the ordinance mean for you? If you're building property here, what it means is if your property development triggers the ordinance, then you've got to make a decision about how you comply with the ordinance. And within the compliance mechanisms, a large number of the options bring with them incentives. Right? Not all of them do, so we're going to walk through where that line divides. And then how do you apply the incentives for maximum impact? This is left to you to be as creative as you want, and when we get there, you'll see this. The ordinance has been drafted to provide a level of flexibility that might be unique in the country in terms of what you get more or less up front, right? I mean, you have to comply with the ordinance rules, and you have to get final sign-off from planning, but written into the ordinance is a lot of flexibility to offset the cost of providing those units. So it's been thought through in a way to, as much as possible, offset that drag on operating earnings as you can. So when we do the process view, we'll show you there's very little change to how you would actually go through a development process now, where you apply to the planning department, fill in all of your forms. You're going to see there's not that much incremental change. So if you're used to dealing with the planning department before the ordinance was in place, you're going to find that there's not much difference to after. Okay. So Cherie, sitting here waiting. Okay, she is your point of contact. If you want to take a picture or anything here, if you have any questions about the ordinance moving forward, if you have a project in mind, you have a question about some clause within the ordinance, Cherie's going to be your person. On the go back one. The BLM.MN Opportunity Housing website, we prepared a bunch of materials. There's an incentive tool, there's a guide to developers, there's almost like a cheat sheet for the incentives. There's a whole range of things, and if you go there, you're going to find it posted. You can see my not so artistic view of, that's supposed to be a one-page summary. No one said how big the page had to be, okay? So I technically stayed within the rule. No, there was no guidance given there. One-page summary, and there's your page. So if you haven't seen it on the way out, again, this will be, I believe, on the website too, right? But unless you've got a plotter to print it, it may not be practical, but you take a picture and zoom it. But all that you'll find it here, right? And these tools are live, meaning as you guys give us questions, we're not gonna keep the document static. As things are received, there will be edits made to the documents to respond so that you sort of see this thing evolve in real time in relation to the feedback we get from you, okay? All right, next. All right, process. So, you want me to do it, or you want to do it? Okay. Okay, so Cherie's going to walk you through a couple process slides, and this is the end-to-end one. So this is the one where the test is going to be.
Thank you, Sean. It's great to be here. I'm happy to see so many of you here, and I really look forward to working with you to build some affordable housing units in the city. So with that said, the red boxes are really what you want to focus on, which is added or different from the planning process in the city of Bloomington. The main difference is I am available to help you identify which tools and incentives will work best for your project. We mentioned that online there is an incentives tool. It is that Daedalus created. It's an Excel spreadsheet where you just plug in the numbers of your project, and it will let you know which tools and incentives you're eligible for. So you will come in and meet with a planner and myself, introduce what you're hoping to develop, and then you will work with us to have a draft affordable housing plan for the first visit to the Development Review Committee, and then we will work with you to finalize your I guess we can switch the slide forward one more. So here we are, informal discussions and guidance, initial affordable housing plan preparation with your initial application to the Development Review Committee, and then begin to start working at that time with the Met Council and Hennepin County and whoever else you'll be working with. And then on to step 2. Yes?
Just one note. If you see so you see we've got the swim boxes, right, for sort of each group's doing their own thing. From your point of view, if you're on the developer side and you're in that first box, what you really need to pay attention to is you've got some homework to do before you come see the city. You've got some idea for your development, right? You can use the tools to sort of firm up what you think is right. You're going to come to the city, talk to Cherie, get some guidance, right? And then that sort of starts one iterative loop. But once you get that loop finished and you go into to the initial plan preparation, if you've done most of your homework and taken on board the guidance from Cherie and locked it down, what you'll find is it's almost like rolling downhill. The process will be reasonably smooth as you move forward unless there's some roadblock or a comment that makes you repeat a step. And it'll normally be guidance from someone in the city or some affiliated party who's asking you, can you please make edits to X, Y, Z, and D? But otherwise, that's really the core of where the OHO's impact is right up front, right?
Great, and so you'll be meeting, thanks Sean, you'll be meeting with me and your planner, likely at the same time. And then you bring your project to the Development Review Committee, and then the next slide will just be finalizing your project, finalizing your numbers, determining which incentives, just because you're eligible for an incentive doesn't mean you necessarily want that incentive. So it will be figuring out which works best for your project, and then having your final application and affordable housing plan go together at the same time for the post-application Development Review Committee. And then if it passes that, you move on to the Planning Commission in step 3. The next slide. You may or may not need to go to the City Council or the HRA board, depending on what financing tools you're utilizing in addition to the incentives. And then that affordable housing plan becomes part of your development agreement or your financing agreement. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's in that later. So, thank you. Yeah, Gretchen.
Is there any point in which the community is engaged about the concepts, or that there's kind of a feedback from the vocational
Yes,
players?
that's a very good point. So the Development Review Committee, that's two opportunities where the plans are made public. They are available to the public. And likewise, for either the Planning Commission, the HRA Board, or the City Council if necessary. We also, I mean, most of the developers that we work with will have community meetings about their projects once they have their site plan and their design and enough information to share. So thank you, good point.
Yeah. So if you notice in the first slide, we talked about you set everything up and it kind of rolls downhill. Just note, the sort of second process level, is it really just iteration on the first? If there's a problem, we send it back, otherwise it goes to the next step. And everything in the bottom two swim lanes, right, really, if it's past the front end reviews, they're just additional checks. Go to the third one. And just about everything you see here down below is only applicable to very particular cases. So it's a reasonably straight shot. I know it looks like a whole lot of boxes and arrows, but really if you follow it through, you set everything up, you apply, they review it. If there's nothing going wrong with it, it goes to the next step. Otherwise, I'll kick it back, so you make a few changes, and it goes back through. And unless there's a trigger for something else, a different, a Met Council review or a watershed district or something, if none of those apply to your project, then it's just a straight flow, ball rolling downhill, right? Okay. All right, requirements. So first of all, before we get into requirements, does anyone, let me ask this, who's never heard of AMI? So I don't want to jump the gun and assume everyone knows AMI. Let me just give you a 10-second spiel on AMI. So when you're trying to adjust for affordable housing, you guys know you're basing it on the resident's ability to pay, right? So that depends on how much money they make. So then the question becomes, well, what's the average for your area? So that's your area median income. Now, Bloomington, the whole St. Paul Bloomington MSA, you may have the only place in America that I've ever seen that your AMI for this year is $100,000. So think about how easy that makes your math. If I say a 30 AMI and you tell me 50, right, and then we know there's a problem, right? It's just real easy. I'm telling you that, but take a look at 80 AMI. I did not make that number. You see that? It's the only one that's actually not 80. It doesn't follow the path. HUD does that, and they set it at 80% of the nation's income. So that's why it's 75.5 instead of 80. But otherwise, it's pretty simple to reverse engineer on an AMI basis for the area. What's a 30, what's a 50, what's a 60, right? So the reason we care about that, and by the way, this is another thing, for those of you who are interested in income trends, the Met Council has some good numbers, and those are just the 2017 to 2019 numbers. You can see there's a $10,000 jump in AMI. Now, we talked about this, if any of you were here for the original developer sort of meetings and public meetings when we were first doing the ordinance, there's a pro and a con to having an area that's got fast economic growth like this, fast income growth. On the one hand, right, people have a lot more money, but on the other hand, often the distribution is flawed or skewed in a way that doesn't necessarily go evenly across the income levels. So a lot of people are making a lot of money, but it doesn't mean everyone's making a lot of money, right? Okay, next. So if we look at what that means for rental housing, and I haven't done sales figures here. Again, this is from Met Council, but this just gives you an idea of what rents would be. So who here has never seen how rents scale by AMI? Because I can spend more time on it if you haven't, and if you have, then I won't spend as much because you know it. Anyway. So the 10-second version is assume that the unit sizes are the same, right? We've got an efficiency, a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom. Depending upon a group's, a resident's ability to pay, that same unit, if it were an efficiency, could generate income between $525 up to $1,400. It's a pretty big spread, right? Depends on their income levels. So as a developer, when you're trying to figure out how to comply with the ordinance, you're going to see a whole lot of language about AMIs. So you need to convert your unit AMIs into rent levels so that when you write your pro forma models, the right numbers for those AMI levels are flowing through. So you can understand the actual impact on your development of having particular AMI levels. Is that clear, or is that way too wonky finance? Yeah.
Is there any requirement as to how you spread the availability of the 60% AMI across the unit types?
No. It's free to choose. What the ordinance does say is generally they want to have a reasonable, we'll get to this in a second, but at a high level, the goal is to not concentrate anything in one unit type, one area, right? It should roughly mirror what you have in your market rate structure. That would be the easiest way to get through planning, I think. Right? So in the ordinance, often what you see is extremely low income, very low income, and low income. And I know this is probably going to be where we have more. Let's take a minute and catch our breath and make sure everyone's on the same page. It's basically mapping out ELI, extremely low income, is everything from 30% ALI and below for the purposes of our being here, right? From 31%, so you go right above the 30%, up to the 50% AMI level, that's our very low income, right? And then from the 51 up to 60, that's our low income. The reason this is important, probably 80% of the incentives that we're going to look at today scale based upon how low you go in your AMI level. So the more you're offering units at the ELI level, the higher the incentives go, right? And incentive levels drop, meaning they're less valuable as you go toward the LI level. You still get them, you still qualify for them, right? As long as you comply with the 9% of total units being at the 60% AMI level or below, you're going to qualify for at least some incentives. But we're going to go through this. There's a whole bunch of levels that depend on knowing this. So just make sure you're comfortable with this. And if I'm not clear, stop me now and we can review. Is okay? All right, next. All right, so we talked about the payment in lieu. We're going to deep dive into that. Just be aware there is a $9.60 fee. It's based on, this is actually as important as the fee is the payment basis. When we talk about the fee, it's going to be based on the leasable interior square footage of your market rate units. So if you've got 100 units, and 9 of them have to be affordable, then on the average of the 91 market rate units, the interior square footage, that's what that's going to be multiplied against, okay? All right, the affordable housing plan, we're going to get into details of it. Just know that there is such a thing. Cherie's the owner of it, and we're going to talk more about that in a second. There's a whole bunch of zones we're going to talk about. It's going to be, we're going to look like a GIS party in a few minutes. So, okay, so here's the actual requirements. So you're building a building. If you're building a building for sale or for rent, there's 2 different levels of qualification to look at. If it's a rental building, then you're targeting 60% AMI. Again, it's the same 9% on both, so the 9% doesn't change. But if you're doing a sale, a for sale project, then it's 110% AMI, right? And as you know, affordable housing for the for sale group, you can go up to, what is it, 35% of total income versus 30% for rentals. So just keep that in mind in the back of your head as you're underwriting these. If you're going to do a NOAA project, there's additional language that's more nuanced. That I'm not going to get too deep into NOAA. The core thing to keep in mind is if it's an in-place product and you were thinking about acquiring it, if you're going to do rehab worth more than 20% of its value, come talk to Glenn from Planning and Cherie, because there's a chance that you may tip that trigger. Not all acquisitions of buildings do tip it, but that's where there's more nuance and probably more depth than we need to get into for this chat, right? Flip. All right, so the ordinance says, okay, now you're building your 100-unit building, it's for rent. Now the question is, you know that you fall under the ordinance. How do you comply? How do you satisfy the conditions of the 9%? There's a lot of flexibility here. There's 4 conceptual buckets. So the first one is you put the units on site, right? That's easy. Within your 100 units, 9 of those units are going to be affordable at the 60% or below level. But there's also some other interesting options. You could put those same 9 units on another site, right? So if you had a different site available and it was acceptable to the city, those units could be put there. If you had, if you knew that you were likely to acquire another building, a NOAA building or a market rate building, and you wanted to put the units there for whatever reason, it made sense, it was financially more viable, whatever it is, technically within the ordinance, those are allowed, again, with planning permission, so it's not in, you can't just bring any building, you can't just assume that it's an automatic trigger, but it's written into the code language, or the ordinance language, that it's allowed. And we're going to deep dive that a little bit more in a second. Then there's a payment option. And payments aren't just one thing. So there's a cash payment option. You could dedicate land that's worth as much or more than your in lieu fee amount. So if you owed the city, let's say $700,000 in lieu fee payments, you could write a check for $700, you could donate land worth $700, or you could give the $700 to an affordable housing partner. Again, with certain criteria, right? But all of those would count as fulfillment of the ordinance. Now, the thing to keep in mind, you can also combine these, and that gets trickier. But technically, you could pay apart, build apart, and put units somewhere else. All of that is pre-built into the ordinance. So you don't have to come to the city and ask for permission. It's more about trying to figure out how you could get your desired plan to fit within the contours of what the ordinance already allows, right? So, okay. So for each one of these, in red below is my take-home point. With the little dashes at the top, that's sort of just telling you what it is. I think the take-home points for our purposes are really what you need to pay attention to. If you are going to put affordable units on site, right, the city's overriding objective here is that you take those units and treat them as much like market rate units as you can, right? That means you don't cluster them in one side of the building, don't make them of a different nature, meaning that the furnishings and fit outs are really, really poor in comparison to the market rate. In a word, don't create stigmatisms around those units. You don't want to make it where it's clearly identifiable that I walk down a hallway and that's an affordable unit and that's a market unit. Don't do that, right? Basically, if you've got enough distribution of the units within your site, and they look and feel like your market rate units, then you're largely likely to be in compliance. When you do off-site compliance, think about it from the city's point of view. They have to make sure that what you're offering is of equal and good value to what you're required to produce. So from that point of view, there's a bunch of secondary issues that have to be provided. But one way to think about it is just from a common sense view. Provide an off-site plan that's fit for purpose. If you're supposed to produce 9 good units for each 100 that you build on in your development plan, make sure that they look, feel, and act like are as valuable as what you would have produced on-site in your plan, right? If you generally feel like they're of pari passu value, equal on both ends, then you're probably okay. If you're going to make a payment, whether it's a payment in lieu, whether it's a land dedication, or whether it's a payment to an affordable housing partner, all 3 of those do not allow you to access incentives. And that's a key difference between all of your compliance options. Those three compliance mechanisms, you make your payment, But from that point on, you're not able to get any height bonuses, density bonuses, parking adjustments, none of that, right? So you have to think carefully, what's in your underwriting best interest? Is it to pay the fee, or is it to comply and then get your benefits, right? Next, and you can make partial fee payments, by the way, but that, again, it's just, there's nuances here that are probably beyond the scope of what we want to get into in a broad setting, but if you guys have questions about it after, feel free to come and ask, or ask now if they pop up. Anyone? Okay. All right, so land dedication. So in theory, you owe the city the money for if you were to do your in lieu payment. But let's say you had a parcel of land that you thought would be excellent for putting affordable housing on. You could donate it, right? Dedicate it over to the city for affordable housing. The value would have to be at least as much as what you owe the city under the in lieu fee payment. But the bottom line here is make sure that what you offer the city as a piece of land is actually useful and good and fit for purpose. Don't provide contaminated industrial land next to a railroad track that no one wants, right? That is likely not going to work. What the city's doing is saying, listen, if you make a good faith effort to give me something of value that I can use to house people in need, then you're doing what we're asking you to. If you bring a junk land that no one wants and can't be used without substantial remediation, that's a problem, right? So a lot of these are just common sense. Okay, the NOAA building option and the market rate building option in a way are similar. Under the ordinance, you're allowed to go and acquire or build acquire properties and basically convert a portion of them over to affordable units. When you do that, because there's more detail required to make sure that the value that's provided is, again, what should be provided, that the unit counts are right. These are the kinds of things where it's harder for me to stand here and tell you it's a straight shot through. That's where you'll have to talk to Cherie and the planning department just to verify the building is right, the transition plan is right. But in theory, it is there, it is allowable. So if you've got an idea of how best to use it, that's where that informal conversation that we saw at the very, very beginning of the development cycle really makes sense, right? Because you bring that idea and you get some good guidance before you spend too much time and money underwriting a deal that might not work, right? Same thing for the market rate plan. If you're going to acquire a building, again, the middle section of the triggers that you want to make sure that you're avoiding so that the deal doesn't get kicked back are all reasonably common sense. I don't think we need to spend more time on it. All right, next. For the compliance option around participating with an affordable housing partner, this is interesting. So if you're a market rate developer, you say, listen, I don't know the affordable housing market. I don't know how it works, but I know an affordable housing guy who does know how it works. And they know this market inside and out. There is a way to allow the market rate developer, rather than paying the city's housing trust fund the in lieu fee, to provide the money to the affordable housing provider. And then that money then is earmarked for a particular project. There are some subtlety and nuance around whether or not the project can have other city money and other things like that. But in principle, that idea exists, right? So in summary, here's just a summary of what that means. Everything but your payment options, literally everything but your payment options, you can get incentives. And if you pay, you can't get incentives. It's really that straightforward. If you get incentives, you owe the city an affordable housing plan. The affordable housing plan, which we'll get to in a second, is really, again, just a commitment from your side to the city that shows how you plan to comply. When we look at the details, though, it's not that challenging. There. Did you want to walk this through? Yeah, okay. Cherie owns this piece of the world, so.
Oh, thank you. So I'm not going to go into detail of what all of those 16 points are because they're covered in the rest of the presentation. But what I did want to point out is there's a handout here today that's titled Opportunity Housing, Affordable Housing Plan Example. It is 4 pages long, filled out. There is also a plan on our website that is not completed, and that is 3 pages. So that just gives you an idea of how much effort it's going to take to create this affordable housing plan. The real work comes in your pro forma and understanding the incentives and the tools that you can use for your development. What we wanted to do is we posted both the affordable housing plan and the sample example document on the website in Word. So if you want to copy this word for word into your plan, you can absolutely do that. Just make sure your numbers and your financing are right, and that it actually applies to your project. But we wanted to make it simple for you. We don't want you to waste time duplicating efforts or recreating forms, but we do want to assist you in meeting the affordable housing requirements and accessing the incentives and tools that you're eligible for. So I think with that I'll end and just remind you that I'm also available to assist as you create this document. Thank you.
Yeah, there's really not much in the affordable housing plan that when you look at it, you're gonna feel like it's a stretch. I think with the example documents and the language that's given there to show you what needs to be filled out, you'll probably do a decent job your first pass through with just tweaks after. All right. Okay, GIS party. This is a map. Can you guys see all the different layers that are here? Got green and blue and red. So the ordinance has different levels of incentives, and within particular incentives, there are geographical preferences given for projects in certain areas. And the only way to really understand how that works is to understand where that lies. So the 2 incentive areas that are most frequently used in the incentives, I think the only 2 that trigger anything, are what's called the designated transit area, sometimes abbreviated DTA. See, it's green, and it goes roughly from, I'm short, so up there, right, all the way over basically to the mall, right? And I think you guys may know what the blue is, the Normandale Lake and Penn American Development Districts. So you can see, I don't know which one is Normandale. Is that one? Okay, so it's from Normandale most of the way right across the top of Bloomington and then over. So this whole area has a series of incentives devoted to it. And then the local opportunity zone. This is not to be confused with the federal opportunity zone. Okay, so local opportunity zone is city specific, nothing to do with the feds, nothing to do with federal legislation. The 2, they share a name, but nothing else. Okay? There is a series of incentives that have a local opportunity zone designation. So in some cases, we will see as we go through the incentives, sometimes they're going to ask you, are you in one or both of these areas, right? And if you're in both, you get X, and if you're in one, you get half X, for example. We'll walk through that. So this is probably the longest stretch that we're going to do now, is I'm going to walk you through 15 different incentives. So if anyone needs a stretch, anything, it's a little boring. This is where all the money's made, right? Okay, so in the ordinance, the 15 incentives are just given as a flat list. There's this, there's this, there's this. It starts at, I don't know, 9.6 maybe-ish, and it goes down to 9.30. What we've done, and again, it's not part of the ordinance, but we've done it just for ease of comprehension, is we've taken the allowable incentives and created 3 buckets. And it helps us talk to you and maybe helps you to ask us questions. The 3 buckets are best thought of as you've got a series of incentives that apply to a building, right? The building, the development plan, something around units or parking or how you face the building. It's something physical. So those are our physical incentives. Then we've got another set of incentives that really apply to the city. and that's how fast the city moves, how much the city charges you, right? Things that are within the city's control, and they're very cleverly listed here as city folk. Took us a long time to come up with that word. And the last one, project specific. Those are the ones that probably have the most, I won't call it wiggle room, but they're the ones you're gonna have to spend the most time creating things. Like if you wanted to do a project that had a TIF district, even if you were allowed the TIF district because you satisfy the requirements, getting a TIF done is not as simple as simply giving a waiver for parking or something, right? There's just materially more that needs to be done. So the project-based vouchers, the land write-down of city-owned land, and the what's the third one? The TIF. Those are the three that when we get to the end, you're going to find there's. I didn't say that much about them because a lot of that is nuanced. You really have to come and talk to people. Okay. So if we just take a big picture look at all the 15 incentives on the left and a bunch of triggers on the top, okay? One way to think about this is you're not going to get any incentive if you didn't comply with the 9% of units at 60% of AMI for a rental building, right? So that's just the default basis. But that said, within the ordinance, they specifically call out either the 9% trigger, or very often they talk about 9% by AMI level. So you're still complying with 9% overall, but the incentives vary based upon how you've distributed your 9% of units, more or less your question, but not by bedroom size, by AMI slice, right? And then if there are other ones, like for example, the development fee, both the deferment and the reimbursement, have different levels of affordability needed. So you can't access those incentives until you've got 20% of your units or 15% for the review of plans, right? So because those are more valuable incentives, the requirement to access them is that you provide more affordable units. And you can see that as you go through to the bottom, again, getting more to the custom side of the incentives, that's where some of the requirements begin to raise. You want a TIF, you're going to have to provide a lot more units. You want project-based vouchers, great, then you're hitting a 50% AMI level, not a 60, right? So again, much of this is sort of common sense. But you'll also note that in some cases you get multiple green boxes, and what that means is the logic within the ordinance is not just a single trigger. In some cases it's either or, meaning you have to have both. In some cases it's you get this if you're on one side, this if you're on the other. And so the local opportunity zone and designated transit area are your two geographical areas. So when you have your project and you overlay it on the map, you'll see, am I getting one or both of those? There are two of the incentives where you have to define a financial need. Now the ordinance does not define what the financial need is, and that's one reason we now have an incentive tool, is to provide a sort of one-stop shop where if both sides can look at a deal from using a common source of information, inputs, and logic, then we can kind of agree, yes, this makes sense, this is the return that you're getting, and I see that you need help, right? Or I see that you don't. And then there are some more specific ideas, like for the landscaping fee in lieu reduction, you can't get that by right, except the city council has to approve it. So I mean, there are minor issues, but in general, this is sort of the flow that you've got to hit. One thing that I'll note, because we'll get into this more when we do the examples, it's possible to get some but not all of the incentives, right? So as you're walking through this, in many cases you're going to find most of the top level sort of up to enclosed parking spaces. That, generally speaking, is going to apply to most development projects. And then everything from there down is going to be more on a case-by-case basis, and it'll really depend if you're offering more affordable units or at lower AMIs, you're likely to trigger those. Am I with you so far? Did that just put everyone into zombie coma? We're good? All right. I was up at 4 a.m., so what's your excuse? All right. So what I've done here is for each one of these incentive slides, the top piece just tells you what it gives you. So we've got density bonuses. Now we've got a density bonus and an FAR bonus. It's really an either or. You're going to pick one, right? If you want additional FAR, and in the incentives tool you can do this. You can toggle between it and see in real time how your IRR changes, how your yield on cost changes, to get a sense of how you want to use that. But the way that the density bonus works is if you're in the ELI level, which again was our 30% and below units, for each ELI unit, by right, you can get 2 market rate units, right? So if you think about it from a cash flow point of view, you're offsetting the lost revenue from the 1 ELI unit by getting 2 additional market rate units, right? And the only way to calculate the 2 market rate units, in addition, is you have to have a baseline that says, here's my offer, so that we know what that base is, so we can add on top of it, right? We'll get to that in a few minutes, but you're almost going to do your underwriting twice. You're going to do it once without any incentives, right? That helps you to understand what you qualify for. And then once we understand how many units you're offering to do and you get cleared for incentives, then you get to add back in your extra FAR or reduced parking and all of the other goodies, right? And basically, the math works very simply. You get 2 market rate units for each ELI or VLI, 1 if it's only an LI. So if you're anything over, what is that, 51%, you're going to get, it's basically a 1-for-1 swap. And anything under that, you get a 2-for-1 sale. All right. And there are some key considerations on the side. I put that there so you know there are always things that might be that might not let you access the incentive. What I've written here on the side are just the high level things. With all of these, you're going to have to come and see Cherie, talk to Glenn, and someone is going to give you a firm thumbs up. But that's what your informal meeting is really designed to do, is you guys get comfortable with what the incentives are. You put together what you think is your best view of the plan. You pitch it to them, and then they will give you some pushback on whether or not there's some compliance issue that doesn't work. But in general, in most cases, it likely would. So the other side of your density bonus is the FAR. If you choose to go this route, then each one of your ELI units gives you 2,000 extra general FAR. So if you were constrained with your density and you wanted to put more, let's say, retail space on the ground floor, this is how you would do it, right? You might say, I don't need any more residential, but I would love to have some extra retail. This is how it would work. And you can see that, again, it just scales. So you get 2,000 extra bonus square feet, gross square feet, for your ELI and VLI units, and then your LI units give you 1,000. So far, so good?
So if you use this one, you can't use the density.
That's right. It's an either or. And again, in the incentives tool, you can toggle between it, so you don't have to guess. You can sort of see how the returns shift in real time. Okay, there's a height bonus. So just by complying with the ordinance in general, in most cases, if you're over, I think it's 3 stories, right, Quinn? Right? So if you're over 3 stories, you can get an extra 1 story, unless things like you're in a flight path, which should be pretty common sense, right? So for the most part, I think there may be also a comp plan or a district plan issue here, but for the most part, it gives you that extra bump, and you'll have to, when you're working with your site architects and things, this might give you some extra leverage when you're trying to figure out how best to use your site for maximum advantage. Okay. Yep. Okay. This will get a lot of people's attention. In most development deals, one of your key cost burdens is parking, right? In some downtown locations, they can get away with no parking, right? Bloomington's not one of those places. I remember one of the developers in the first session, he made a joke about, I could build a building with no parking. I wouldn't have any tenants, but I could build it, right? So, we're cognizant of, too, that there's a sort of market reality about having a car and using a car. But if you think about what the city's done here, it's actually pretty clever. It's saying, we're gonna give you regulatory relief to the extent that you can maximize that regulatory relief in the context of your market, right? So if there's a market demand for slightly fewer parking spaces, you don't have to build them, right? If you comply here.
But, hey, Sean, could you address something though, because this has come up multiple times? Address the question that the parking tool in particular is not actual real cash in the project. Because I've had developers tell me, well, there's no way this is actual real, but the way I see it, at 35, 40,000 per stall, having 40%, 20%, 30%, that's actual real dollars. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're underwriting a project, right, normally you've got your normal hard cost budget for the building itself, then you're gonna underwrite parking. And in most cases, parking doesn't pay for itself in a project like this, right? Maybe you're getting monthly parking, $100 a month, 150 max. If your stall cost is, if you're above ground, 17,500, 1,800, below ground, maybe 30 grand, 35 grand, if you don't have to build half of what you had to build, that's a true monetary savings, right? So that's what this allows you to do. If you were originally spec'd out to have 150 parking spots, say 1.5 per unit on a 100-unit building, and suddenly you only have to do 75 of those spaces, you just save 75 times the stall cost, right? So that's should be a reasonable return on the savings there.
But you can't charge for parking.
Only for, you can charge parking, you can't charge the OHO, the opportunity housing tenants for their parking spaces.
Right. And do you need to allocate one for every unit?
That's a question for Glenn.
Yeah, so we've been talking about that. We recently made a commitment, just last time of night. And if you had an opportunity tenant who did not want to take advantage of the unit, this applies to storage too, then you could lease that out until such time as the tenancy change, the new tenant, an opportunity wanted to access it, then first available either storage unit or parking space would then go out. But if opportunity tenants did not want the spaces, you could then lease them.
It sounds like a right of first refusal sort of thing. You offer it, if they don't want it, then go on. But, yeah.
But if you have 100% affordable project,
Hmm?
then it would be available to opportunity tenants. I mean, in terms of the inability to charge.
Yeah, then I don't think you could charge.
Would be able to
Yeah.
Talking about like the tax credit.
No, just in the ordinance that where it's written, yeah, you just wouldn't be able to charge for the parking. 'Cause it,
Which is revenue.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
you can charge parking typically for light tech project.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
that would- there's some-
That's right, so
there's
you,
some balance there.
that's right, yeah, you would have to underwrite both to see which one made the most sense.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's why, sort of with all the incentives, that's why we made the tool, and you can't, I mean, the tool's limited in some ways. Like, we're not doing a comparison with LIHTC, but I mean, that would be exactly the kind of thing you'd be underwriting against to see how do we best make this pencil, especially on a 100% deal, right? But here again, the one nuance that I didn't mention, we talked about how the parking stall count changes as you provide additional affordable units. But if you're in the green area that we showed you, that shaded area on the map, the bonus doubles, right? So you can see.
Going back to the map.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's the green. Okay, so flip back to the other one. More. One more. So you can see at max, you could actually reduce your total parking count by 40%. If you were providing your 9% of units to the, so imagine 100-unit building, you have 9 at affordable, which is not a huge number, but you just dropped 40% of your potential parking stalls. Yeah, it's not a bad trade. Okay, flip to the next one. And concurrently with that, you can convert some of the required enclosed spaces, enclosed stalls, to carport covered stalls. So while it's not a loss of the stall, it's a substantial reduction in the cost of the stall, right? Yeah.
Do you have any discussions with lenders as you started to put this together relative to their willingness to underwrite projects that have
Lower parking.
significantly lower parking requirements?
No, we left that to the developers and the lenders, meaning this is just saying it's regulatory relief on the city side, but you still have to make a decision whether or not it's fundable, whether the market wants it. I mean, this is giving you still the option to be the developer, to make all those decisions, just saying that it is possible to not have to do it. Otherwise, by code, you would have to build those, right? And I know I work with Bank of America a lot on other deals, and I've seen where they have seen both sides of it. They will say sometimes they want more parking because they're worried about what the other developer told us, is they don't want an empty building. And in center city projects, I've seen them say the other thing, why are you guys building so much parking? So
I haven't seen that in Minneapolis area yet.
Yeah.
Maybe San Francisco.
Yeah, it's strange, even in other parts of the country like Charlotte, which is not a super urban area, that idea is starting to sort of take root. But I mean, Bloomington, you've still got enough sort of open suburban scale space, it's probably not here yet. Next. Okay, minimum unit sizes. So you can actually take your affordable units and shrink them slightly. Not all the units, but if the code has a minimum unit size of X square feet, then you're allowed to reduce slightly, again, according to the formula that's here, based upon the unit distribution that you have, but you can only take one, it's not a cumulative count. So you have to take one size reduction, and I'm going to walk you through how to determine what size reduction works when we get to the example. Because if you have units that cross AMI levels, right, then you have to figure out, are you at ELI, LI, or VLI? I'm going to show you how that works. But just in your head, conceptually keep in mind that you can, in fact, reduce the affordable units by some fraction depending upon the affordability level that you've got plugged in, okay? Alternative exterior materials. So if you've got these are all on non-street facing materials. So if you wanted to use a fiber board, and the code says you can't use fiber board, you actually can on certain percentages of the face of the building if you comply or if your units are spread in a certain way, right? So again, just looking at regulatory ways that they could reduce what the cost of compliance would be in ways that don't materially impact the look and feel of the building. So again, these are all non-street facing frontages, but it gives you a bit of a cost or reduction. Next. Storage spaces. When we came here to do the first round of these education sessions, I had no idea that the storage units were required by law. So all the developers came running up after and said, "Do you know we have to build storage spaces?" I didn't know, so they told us. So it was one of the things we made sure that we had some relief here to say, well, you can actually reduce the number of required storage spaces if you are in compliance. And if you look, it's a very simple compliance check. If you've got the trigger, you can reduce it by half. Right? So basically, if you're providing the number of affordable units that you have to under the ordinance, it's more or less, I won't say automatic, but pretty close to it. The landscaping fee in lieu reduction probably applies, it's more of an edge case. I don't know how frequently, Glenn, you may know, does this ever happen often?
It's happened one time
Yeah.
today. Very rare.
Yeah, so this is an edge case. Don't spend too much time on this, but basically, if you had a site that there was required landscaping on, there is a way to avoid the fee for doing the landscaping if you were in compliance with the ordinance. That's the most simple way I can say it. Okay, now we'll get to where everyone sharpens their pencils and pays attention. There is a way to get your development fees reimbursed. And if this would be a bar, this is a scene where the door opens and the record skips it across it, and all the developers perk up and say, "What's that?" Deferred development fees. So, or reimburse them. what the city's trying to do here is a bit of give and take. So if you're willing to go above and beyond the minimum requirements of the ordinance, and you see it starts at 20% and goes up to 50%, if you were to have a project that had 50% affordable units at 60% or below, you could technically get 100% of your fees reimbursed for all or portion of the building permit fees, park dedication fees, sewer availability charges. And if you're a developer, you know you're averaging what, about 2.1%, I think was the number I saw somewhere in that neighborhood of total cost we're going to city level fees. That's a material change. But they're not giving you that up front. They're saying if you provide more than the ordinance requires, then we will consider doing that, right? But again, it's baked into the pie. So unlike other cities where you have to really negotiate and plead, this is already designed in the ordinance to be something that is allowable. You just have to come and show. Now, here's where the tricky bit is, demonstrated need. If your project makes a ton of money, it's gonna be really hard to say, dear city, I know you've got all these other needs, but I really don't wanna pay you. That's where it's gonna fall down. But if you're providing 50% of units, for example, it's unlikely that you're gonna be killing it on the profit department, so the need is probably reasonably readily apparent, right? So, you know, it's a reasonable, common sense way to offer the quid pro quo, right? Okay. Now you can defer it. This is probably, I would argue this may be the only place in America doing this, and it's probably the most interesting if you were to track this on a policy level basis. So here what's going on is the city is going to let you defer paying your fees under certain conditions. Now, why would a deferment be interesting? If you're a developer and you're putting cash into a project, those fees come out early, right? It's part of your equity. What happens if you can pay it 12 or even 24 months after your certificate of occupancy is issued? Is that with your equity money, or often what happens? You stabilize, you refi the project. In many cases, you're pulling cash out, right? So as that cash out comes out, right, you can often pay with the refinance proceeds. So it's actually a very interesting way to let you keep more of your money by providing the units that the city needs, and the city still gets its money in the end. But to do this, you're going to owe the city something. You're going to pay an interest payment, 5% per year, right? But that's a pretty reasonable charge. So basically, you get a 5% float on your money for 12 to 24 months after the certificate of occupancy is issued. To get the higher, the 24-month window, you got to get your 20% of units. Otherwise, it's still pretty generous. You can get a 12-month deferment at the 9% level. That's a pretty interesting benefit. Ever see that any other place? Bueller. Bueller. All right, next thing. Expedited review of plans. We heard this, Amit, prior to doing this session, he called a bunch of municipalities all across the U.S. He asked them a bunch of questions. What are your developers looking for in their affordable housing plans and these inclusionary housing ordinances? What are they asking for? Time and time again, it came up that they wanted to see an expedited review of plans. Now, I know that Glenn and his team are reasonably efficient. They're not slowing you down that much. But that said, to the extent that it's possible, under certain circumstances, these plans can in fact be fast-tracked. But you remember we talked about triggers that were geographic. So here, you're either basically in the local opportunity zone, which is again that hash-marked area that we saw earlier, and we want to see an additional level of affordability, 15% versus the 9%. Right? But if you're there, then you can technically qualify for it. Yeah, that's really it. Okay, now we're going to get to our last three incentives. These are the ones that are the project-specific ones. These are the more wonky. Assume here that these are, again, for cases where your project may need a little more nuance or massaging. If the city owns land and the city wanted to provide that land to you to write down the value so that you could do your project, it's possible, right? But you got to have 20% of units available at the 60% or AMI band for the rental or 110 for the for sale side. But, that middle thing may not be right, I'm looking at, but the land cost, but it has to go to the city council for approval. So it's not something that Eric or Glenn or Cherie can say okay to. You would have to find a parcel that the city owns, make a case for it. They would help you to work through what you have to document in order to make that case to city council, and then ultimately the council is gonna decide one way or another. It would be out of everyone's hands in here, right? So just to be clear, it's not automatic. It's in the ordinance that it's possible, and it's recognized, but it's not automatic. Same thing with the TIF. So in theory, you can ask for a TIF, right? The minimum requirement is 20% of your units be affordable, but even at that level, you can see that there's a question of whether or not they're eligible under the state's TIF policy, so you gotta make sure that you're sort of tracking with what the state requires as well as what the city. And there's this need issue, again, anytime you come to the city and ask questions about, I need you, city, to write me, developer, a check, that's where you're gonna have a lot more show me the need for why I need to give you a check versus provide regulatory relief, which is, again, common sense. It's taxpayer money, right? Okay, and the last one are project-based vouchers. So here, what they're targeting is if you're gonna provide affordable housing units at 50% AMI or less, then you have the potential to get project-based vouchers. But project-based vouchers, if you know anything about them, they have their own set of rules, right? In terms of triggering, what's it, Davis-Bacon, it's the labor rate changes. So there's a whole bunch of things from an underwriting point of view that you'd want to make reasonably clear that you understand as you would walk through that process. It's technically there, it's available, but that would be something that probably has a much longer time period from an underwriting point of view to figure out. Though the benefit is at the end, you've got guaranteed vouchers attached to the project to pay the difference between what the tenant can pay and what HUD's sort of fair market rents are. So, it is powerful. All right. Everyone feel like they just swam the English Channel? Was that painful? They're good incentives, it's just tedious to walk through that stuff, so I'm sorry, but it had to be done. So what questions do you have on incentives, if any, before we go into examples? Anything? We're good? All right, let's go to some examples. All right, so developer's view, different than the view Cherie showed you, which was the city level view of you apply here, you do this, we check it, if we like it, it goes here, if we don't, it goes there. As a developer, it's actually fairly simple. Think about it as you're on an interstate and you're trying to figure out which exit do I take, okay? First of all, does the OHO apply to your project? If it doesn't, you take the first exit. You're gone, there's no need to worry about it. Next exit. It does apply, so you figure out how you're going to satisfy it. If you're going to make a payment, whether it's direct cash to the Housing Trust Fund, to an affordable housing guy, or to or the land dedication option, you're going to do your development but without incentives. So you still have to comply with the payment requirements, but the incentives are gone. If you pass that, then you're going to create the affordable housing plan that Cherie talked about, and then you're going to pick and choose from the incentives available for your project. So that's reasonably straightforward, right? So now, if we were to look at 3 example projects, cleverly numbered 1, 2, 3, and you can see one is on the border of our DTA, but not in it, right? So we're in, I don't know where we are. We're not in the DTA. In 2, we're in the DTA and we're in the local opportunity zone. And in the third one, you can see we're in the DTA but not in the opportunity zone. Okay? So what I wanted to do was just give 3 examples of how this is going to work. So before I go into the nitty-gritty of it, what's your gut take on sort of what are we about to walk through here? I'm asking you because everyone's going to end up spacing out. So. Anyone? I'm going to give the winning lottery numbers to whoever can ask the best question. All right, let's go to the next. All right, so we're going to do these. So assume it's a new building, 100 units, keep the math straight. I put a high parking stall number on it just so we can use it for our purposes. So we got 207 parking, 100 enclosed. So here's what's going to change. In option 1, 9% of the units are all at 60 AMI, one band. Okay. You saw that it was outside of all of our geographical preferences, and none of those incentives are going to apply. In option 2, we've got the same 9%, but now we mix it up. We're going to get crazy. We're going to cross AMI boundaries. And we're inside the DTA and the local opportunity zone. In point of fact, option 2 is probably the most relevant for most developments because it's probably how it's going to work, right? Option 3 is, I just moved it outside of one of the geographical zones and reduced the AMI so we could look at what other benefits you can qualify for. Okay. If you're a developer, I can't stress this enough, when you're doing the model, the incentive tool or your own model, you're gonna underwrite without any incentives first. So if you've got a 100-unit building, you're gonna underwrite at 100 units with 9 of those being at whatever AMI you've chosen or mix of AMIs, and full parking counts, and your IRR might be whatever it is, right? But that's how you have to apply. You bring that plan, you can run it with the incentives after, but that plan together with the post-incentive plan together have to be brought to the city, because that initial plan is the basis for the calculations on the FAR and the density and parking and things like that. You need a base to calculate what the adjustments are, right? Which makes sense. And basically, once you've got the pre-incentive and the post-incentive plans, then you've got the ability to then iterate within those to see if you want to make additional changes to your core plan and then how that impacts your incentives. And there's basically a couple of feedback loops there until you get the plan stable and financially feasible. All right, next. All right, so we talked about this. So go. All right, so we're gonna put all our units on site. That's one important thing to note. So I grayed out the 2 and 3. We're over there. Go. All right, so now let's look at this. So because we've got 9% of units at 60%, all of the green we already qualify for, right? And just keep in mind that the FAR and the density bonus are ors, either or, right? You're gonna pick one or the other. But you can see you're getting a density bonus or a floor area ratio bonus, a height bonus, minimum unit size reduction, get the alternative exterior, material, storage space, landscape fee, and enclosed parking space reduction, all more or less right away. Now, where you see the reds, we're not triggering those, and on the parking reduction, we are not in the DTA, so even though officially we hit the AMI band, we don't qualify for the incentive because we're outside of the designated transit area, right? So you just have to be careful that when you're doing this and you think, well, I've got the units, why don't I get the incentive? You qualify for part of the trigger, not all of the triggers, right? And some of these over here that are yellow are shaded yellow because you really, if there's a question of need, both the incentives tool and our high-level summary, we don't know whether or not you've got a need for that, but some of these things still need additional discussions with planning in order to get to a final determination of whether or not you qualify for the incentive. The same thing with the council. We wouldn't know in advance what the council would decide. Okay, so now let's get crazy. Now we're going to spread our 9% of units over. Instead of doing any at the LI, we have 6 at LVI and 3 at ELI. So it should be VLI, it's just a typo. So the VLI, if you recall, is our middle range affordability, and ELI is the 30% and below, right? So I think it's 31 to 50 and then 30 and below. So we've got our 9, but again, it crosses the unit. So how do you guys think we're gonna be able to figure out where the tipping point is? How do you qualify? The good news for you is I've got a slide explaining it. All right, we got the location. So this one, it's the same thing, except what we're going to do, so basically all of this is the same, except now we've moved, so we qualify for our parking reduction, which we didn't qualify for before. Even though we're in the local opportunity zone, we don't trigger the AMI levels needed, so again, we lose out on all of those. But in principle, you get a fairly large number of reductions just by complying with the requirements. Here's where things get interesting. So if I had, and this is common sense, right? If I have all of the units in one bucket, so you see in example 1, and 9% in my LI category, it doesn't matter if it's LI, VLI, or ELI, if it's 9% in a band, you qualify, right? And you get the level of incentive specified by that 9% because you've got the trigger met. If, for example, though, we have the one I just told you, where we get 6% here and 3% here, you may scratch your head and say, whoa, why am I qualifying at LI? How does that work? Well, think about it like this. You start with the lowest, or let's say the lowest level of the affordability, you know, the ELI units, and we're going to add to it. 0 is not 9, it's less than 9, so we add 6 to it, right? At 6, so if we add VLI to ELI, we still don't have 9, right? But what happens if I add 6 to this? I get my 9 trigger. So you're basically just starting at the top and summing till you cross 9. When you cross the 9% threshold, that triggers the incentive, right? So I can't stress how important this is because you're likely to have AMI bands in your projects. And if you do, if you don't calculate this right, it's going to cause you to be frustrated with the city and the city to be frustrated vice versa because the calculations and what each side believes to be true isn't right. So just internalize how this works. We're going to count from the lowest level of affordability up until we cross that 9% threshold, right? And you see it again here. I've got 8%. As soon as I get to my 1, I've triggered the VLI, right? Because again, I'm at 9%. Was that as exciting as you thought it was going to be? All right. So we're almost done. Can you believe how much fun we've had so far? I can keep going. You guys want to just camp out? I'll get some pizza. All right, so we've got the same 100-unit building. The only difference is we've reduced our AMIs. I kept them all in one band. Again, we're out of our local opportunity zone, but still within the designated transit area. So here what you see is now you can see on the left, we've basically gotten everything except for the development fee reimbursement because we didn't hit we're not in the local opportunity zone and the expedited review of plans because we're not at 15% of total units being affordable. What's interesting though is you see we got a development fee deferment potentially. We don't know if there's a need. But actually that should probably be read out. So that should be read too. But you can have cases where you have a qualifying trigger and a non-qualifying trigger and still get the incentive if it's an either or. So you have to read the ordinance carefully to make sure that each incentive, each requirement is ticked off. Because in some cases they're all required and in some cases it gives you the option to say if you have this or this. And so it's a twofold trigger, right? Okay. And now it's your turn. This is where we drop the disco ball and karaoke starts. So who's up?
At what point, what kind of information do you need to have to be able to start using the online tool?
For the incentives tool, so there's 3 things we have, or maybe 4 online now. There's the incentives tool, which typically, I can even pull it up on screen and show you, but it starts with, you answer a couple questions about your project. Is it in the transit zone? Is it in the local opportunity zone? How many units? This kind of thing. Then you flip to the second tab, and it asks you to allocate your units, whether market rate or by AMI, by bedroom. So it's like a little pro forma book that you plug and play on. It auto-calculates parking, and because parking is really nuanced, it's there may be some requirement to further massage those numbers. But it'll generate some parking numbers, and then you provide estimates for your rents, your other income, stuff like that. And basically what it's going to do is just give you a quick stabilized NOI based upon what you tell it is the development cost per square foot, cost of your stalls. I mean, it's reasonably high level, but enough to get some kind of yield on cost and IRR level, right? And that again is just so, because every developer has their own book that they want to use, their own model. And to keep things where you've got a common view of how the project shapes up, it's there to help you understand what you might qualify for and to facilitate conversations with planning about what the initial returns are looking like. If there's a question of need. If there's not a need question, then it's less important. You can just use it for the incentives part. Right?
Has the city identified what they believe the levels of return should be to developers, so you have a
No.
threshold?
No. I don't, yeah, the original conversations, even in the first group, weren't trying to say this is an acceptable level, meaning that's still a market decision. You would still have to sort of make a case for why it wouldn't work in your situation. But I mean, ideally, we're going to see examples from other developers too. So it's pretty obvious if you've got an 18 IRR and you're saying I need help, and the other guys are doing it at 15 with none. It's easier to say that you got to make a better case, right? Yeah. All right. Yeah.
You talk about, some of the materials talks about why the city's doing it, but give a bigger perspective of what's driving this for the city, and then also talk about some of the sites throughout the city, as far as the city's openness to rezoning some of those sites. I think in Bloomington, for instance, where there's so many large single-family lots and so forth. Can you address any of those issues?
I can tell you about the first one, but not the second one. So the first one, when we did the first study with BAE, there was a group, I always forget their name, there was an affordable housing study done by, I knew the lady's name and Maxfield, yeah. So the Maxfield study was done before, that was part of the earlier work that Eric was talking about. They had projected affordable housing needs out to, 2030 or something like that. And in point of fact, what they had pointed out is actually coming to pass, which is you've got really strong income growth here. So in a way, you've got a different set of problems in a lot of municipalities, right? Your incomes are rising to such a level that in a way it's bidding up housing prices, so you're just sort of pricing out people who are your Uber and Lyft drivers and the baristas and stuff like that. So the idea was if you wait too long and you try to play catch up because of the development cycle, you're gonna always be in catch up mode, right? So if you start now trying to actively provide new units that are coming onto the pipeline, you're already starting to get ahead of the project. But because these, remember, opportunity housing units ride along with market units. So you're getting a little bit of incremental units, but it's already starting that process, building them in. And then there's the protection on NOAA that's happening as a sort of separate issue. But the combination of all of these things just helps to keep and maintain one stock of affordable housing. And then on the East Bloomington lots, I think that's an Eric's question.
What was the question?
Well, I was just asking about rezoning some of the lots and how will the city council be rezoning a number of the large lots where the highest issues may not be what they were originally, what sits there today.
Let me talk to Glenn, plan right behind you, to address that one.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. I'd say the council's been very open.
Do you want a mic, Glenn?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd say that council's been very open to rezoning historically. We actually have a development underway by MWF 108 Place, and that was rezoned, upzoned by the council. So I'd say if it's near a commercial node, council has generally been very supportive of that. And then single family, the council's been looking for ways to reduce costs and support affordability, adding ADUs for accessory dwelling units, things like that as well.
I realize the ordinance will go into effect until September 1st, but what are you hearing? Have you had some inquiries? Have you had some initial conversations?
I can tell you this, and Glenn can also add in on this one, that
we are finding that the creation of the ordinance is not slowing down development. It's actually having the opposite effect. Glenn could probably get into more detail, but we're seeing projects moving our way. We've got no sort of indication that this is horrific, it's going to destroy the world. We haven't gotten any of that, so I would say though, back to my earlier comment, as of September 1, I think we're going to start to get a different feel to see how the reactions start to come in. But in terms of what's heading in our pipeline, there's been no concern. So that's what I would think.
Thank you very much.
Very nice. All right. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.